very pleased today to welcome Professor Mark Winfield as our guest speaker. He will be dealing with the issues that are confronting our energy system in Ontario and looking at Ontario's energy policies. It will generate discussion, I'm sure, and after the presentation, we'll have a moderated question and answer period with Liz Anderson moderating. And now I am very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Professor Mark Winfield. Professor Winfield brings to today's webinar an abundance of experience in the analysis of Canada's environmental and energy policy options and political actions. After 10 years with the Canadian Institute for Environmental Law and Policy, he joined the Pembina Institute as a program director before becoming a professor at York University in 2007. Currently, in addition to being a professor of environmental and urban change at York University, he is also co-chair of York University's Sustainable Energy Initiative, as well as professor and coordinator of the joint Masters of Environmental Studies Juris Doctor program, which is offered to students in conjunction with Osgoode Law School. His career focus has been environmental policy, specifically policy, law, and governance of environmental, sustainable energy, and electricity issues relating to the energy transition across Canada. He has worked extensively in Ontario, which we will be talking about today. He is also the author of numerous books, refereed articles, and opinion pieces in journals, as well as in national newspapers. And most recently, he has edited, along with two colleagues, a book, Sustainable Energy Transitions in Canada, that was released last year. This book is a real key to understanding the status of energy transitions in Canada today. It is available to you on via open access through the UBC Press website, and we'll be posting that in the chat, that link. You can also obtain the book in bookstores in Ontario, well, across Canada, and also at the Toronto Public Library. It's an excellent read and very informative. With this very brief outline of Professor Winfield's expertise, I will turn the webinar over to Mark and look forward to his talk on sustainability, pathways to decarbonization, and the future of Ontario's energy systems. Thank you, Mark.
Great, thank you. Good morning. Very happy to be with you. So today I'm going to be giving a bit of an overview of where we are in terms of energy and electricity and climate change policy in Ontario, and a bit of how did we get there, and also importantly, where do we go from here, which is a complicated and becoming more complicated question for a number of reasons. For those who study energy and electricity, the electricity story in Ontario is a really excellent case study because there are all kinds of tensions and convergences going on within this conversation, particularly as unfolded in the last 20 years or so. So debates over focus on more distributed approaches to supplying energy versus more centralized approaches. There's a sort of convergence going on around climate change, decarbonization strategies, the role of electrification in that process, and the question of relationship to larger questions of sustainability. And then there's also in more concrete terms, we're in the middle of very significant debates in the process of determining future pathways around the role of nuclear, natural gas, or fossil gas, as it's sometimes referred to now, renewables, energy storage, distributed resources, which I'll talk about a little bit, demand side and energy efficiency, and the sort of relationship between all of these different components in formulating pathways forward. This is a story that goes back a long way, and in many ways sort of what we've been through was a period of for the first 90 years in Ontario up until the late 1990s, a period of relative stability institutionally. Policy is a little more complicated. But the Ontario Hydroelectric Power Commission and its successor, Ontario Hydro, were vertically owned, Crown-owned, vertically integrated monopolies. They built and owned virtually all of the electricity generating assets in Ontario: hydro, coal, nuclear. They built and owned the provincial electricity transmission grid as well, and provided electricity distribution services, particularly in rural areas. The other significant actor in more urban and towns and cities have been the local distribution utilities like Toronto Hydro and Electra, and they were the other sort of significant institutional player. But Ontario Hydro was pretty dominant. Oops, there we go. Now, nearly 30 years ago, and what really sets off this period of instability was the collapse of Ontario Hydro. It effectively bankrupted itself. It massively overbuilt supply, ended up hugely in debt. There was also growing concerns in that context over the lack of effective regulatory oversight, or indeed anyone exercising any apparent control. And indeed, the utility's reputation for technological competence had collapsed as well, with the need to take the 7 oldest nuclear reactors out of service virtually overnight in 1997 because a series of both operational and maintenance issues, and that led to a huge ramping up of the role of coal-fired electricity, among other things. That led to the breakup of Ontario Hydro into a series of successor corporations, and these are part of the alphabet soup that we deal with today. Okay. So, OPG, as it's known, Ontario Power Generation, emerged as the principal successor, and it ended up owning all of the nuclear, coal, and hydro generating assets that had been owned by Ontario Hydro. There's a slight complication with the Bruce nuclear facility, but we'll come back to that later. Hydro One Networks took over the provincial transmission system and rural distribution systems as well. And now this is OPG is still owned by the province. Hydro One Networks is semi-privatized. That adds another layer of complications to the story. And then finally, there was originally an independent market operator whose job it was. The theory in the late 90s, we were going to marketize the system, that Ontario Power Generation's role in the system would diminish down towards maybe a third of total generation, that you would have new actors coming into the system, private actors who would build new generating resources, and that anybody would be able to sell electricity into the market. And there was an independent market operator set up. It's now the independent electricity system operator, basically to coordinate that process of operating, combining supply and demand on a minute by minute kind of basis. And there is also sort of a planning mandate, but not fully, associated with the independent electricity system operator as well. This is known by the acronym of the IESO. So that's sort of the institutional landscape that we're kind of looking at the moment. We're not operating here. This just sort of shows how the supply mix evolved over time, in the early part anyway. Up until about 1960, the electricity system in Ontario was almost completely hydroelectric. It's been described totally gravity fed. It's been described as a near perfect renewable energy system. The problem by the late 50s and early 60s was that we ran out of readily developable hydro sites, and combination of economic growth and population growth just meant the demand began to outstrip that supply. We first started building coal plants. You see here fossils starting to appear. And then between the 60s and the 90s, embarked on this massive nuclear construction project where we built the Pickering, Bruce, and Darlington plants, a total of 20 reactors. And by the mid-90s, that accounted for about 60% of total supply in the province. You can see water, hydro shrinks back to 25% of supply. That's not because the amount of hydro we had went down, it's that demand basically quadrupled during that period. Um, you look in 98, in the aftermath of the NAOP, um, you see water stays the same, but the beginning of this large growth in the role of fossil, meaning coal. That set in motion a series of decisions because the ramp up of the coal plants was associated with severe smog episodes, particularly in southern Ontario. I mean, their output more than doubled, and that meant that their output of carbon, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, um, particulate matter, heavy metals, all of the pollutants associated with coal also doubled. That led to commitments in 2003 to phase out coal on a variety of different timelines, a process that was actually completed in 2013. And this has been described as the single most significant thing that's been done in North America to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so far. And you can see here that coal was 25% of the system in 2003, and by 2014, it's zero. The two significant things that happen, you'll notice nuclear has gone up, and that was partially because some of the units that were taken out of service in 1997 did come back into service, although not all of them. And we do also start to see a presence of non-hydro renewables. That's basically wind and solar principally, and this is the product of the Green Energy Act. So installed capacity, this doesn't matter quite so much in the sense of um, in terms of where does energy actually come from. But the thing to note here is there's nearly 5,000 megawatts of wind, which was added between 2009 and 2018. So very, very fast build out. And then the other significant component, this is more at the distribution level. So at the connected to local hydro systems, this again is a product of the feed-in tariff program under the Green Energy Act, more than 2,000 megawatts solar, mostly rooftop. So the big shifts here happening is coal is gone. Renewables are going up dramatically, nearly 8,000 megawatts in a period of not much more than a decade. But then also, as we'll see, an increase in the role of nuclear kind of ramping back up towards about 60% as well. And that sort of here's the output from 2022, which sort of shows that. So system about 54% nuclear, 25% hydro, wind and solar combined now mounting to about 10%, which is significant given that we started from zero, although there were obviously complications that came out of that. A number to watch will be the portion of gas, because as part of the coal phase out, we not only built renewables, we also built about 5,500 megawatts of new gas-fired generation as well. That role has fell and now is starting to rise significantly, and I'll come back to that. The last formal plan that we had for the system, and this was introduced by Kathleen Wynne's government now 7 years ago, more than 7 years ago, at that stage was committing to the refurbishment of the Darlington and Bruce nuclear facilities, a life extension on the Pickering B facility, which is 4 reactors. But there was also a significant conservation program, which turned out to be quite successful. But even at this stage, it was looking like any further significant development of renewables was being abandoned for now. This predates Doug Ford. Part of the problem was that electricity rates began to rise very dramatically from 2003 onwards. And as we know, this became a significant political issue. The Green Energy Act was very widely blamed for this, although the actual breakdown is a lot more complicated. And on the supply side, the single biggest cost was around the nuclear refurbishments. Interestingly, the Wynne government also got rid of any requirement that there be a planning process, and that any plans be reviewed by the Ontario Energy Board, which essentially meant that the system was left running on what are called directives from the Minister of Energy. These are political fiats, and the various actors in the system are required to conform with the directives. This sort of sets up what I've called a paradigm of explicit political management. We've essentially cut the idea that would be a plan, and we've cut the idea that that plan would be subject to some sort of external review by the Ontario Energy Board or previously by the Environmental Assessment Board. Those requirements are gone. We are flying basically on directives that come out of the minister's office, which in part largely means the premier's office. Mr. Ford arrived promising to clean up the hydro mess. I'm not sure how much that really happened, but at least initially, as we know, the first move was to cancel the last tranche of renewable energy projects. These were largely community-based. In some cases, wind turbines were literally, and I mean literally, ripped out of the ground. The cost of canceling those contracts, at least 231 million. It's probably actually more. The Green Energy Act was repealed, although effectively the wind government had already mostly wound down the feed-in tariff program. The Conservation First conservation strategy was terminated on the basis that it was actually being too successful in reducing demand. This was sort of removed a few cents off people's hydro bills. More broadly, the wind government's fairly comprehensive climate change action plan was completely terminated, including there was a cap and trade system with Quebec and California, which was effectively a carbon pricing regime. That's all gone. The last sort of vestige of a planning process was also removed. And although there were repeated offers from Monsieur Legault, the Premier of Quebec, those were emphatically rebuffed. So that's sort of where we took renewables off the table, we took conservation off the table, and we took the possibility of strengthening the connection to Quebec off the table, which may be effectively doing a fairly good job of painting oneself into a corner. But that's what the Ford government did. There was a new plan, although it's not really a plan. I'm not sure what you'd call it. I suppose a policy statement. A little more than a year ago, Powering Ontario's Growth. And it places a very, very strong emphasis on nuclear. This sort of flowed from an earlier study done by the IESO called Pathways to Decarbonization. And it looked at, well, what would it take to move Ontario towards net zero? And the answer is a more than doubling of capacity within the electricity system to 88,000 megawatts at a cost of at least $400 billion. It was never clear how that was going to be paid for or who would pay for it. But this was the sort of number that was being put out. The biggest single driver here, although there are assumptions about electrification of certain industries, notably steel, electrification of space heating is the biggest sort of single element here if one were to take this pathway. It kind of provides the foundation for the Powering Ontario plan, although in practice, the real focus has been, in terms of what's actually been operationalized, is a very strong emphasis on nuclear and a very strong emphasis on gas and nothing else. There's a little bit of re-engagement around conservation, but nothing like what there was before. So we're looking at ongoing refurbishment at Darlington of the existing 4 units, and then a proposal to build 3 new 300 megawatt units at Darlington. There's an ongoing refurbishment of 6 reactors at the Bruce nuclear facility, which is owned by OPG, but run by Bruce Power. and a proposal for 4,800 megawatts of new nuclear capacity, and also now confirmed an intention to proceed with the refurbishment of the Pickering B plant, which is 4 reactors. That had been previously assessed as uneconomic. Um, the total investment on nuclear, by my back of envelope calculations, is in excess of $100 billion, which makes this possibly the biggest nuclear construction and expansion project in, I think, in Western Europe and North America at the moment. There is also, as part of the same strategy, both a ramping up of the output from existing gas-fired plants to almost 100% operation from what had been very small operation earlier, and in addition, at least initially, of 1,500 megawatts of new gas-fired generation as well. So in terms of what's actually being committed to by the government, there's a little bit of a wrinkle to this, but basically nuclear and gas is the pathway that's actually being operationalized. If you look at the pathway study, they actually talk a lot about renewables, Quebec, a little bit on conservation. That part has not got much uptake. The impact of the gas ramp up is quite dramatic. We're going from a situation, a low around 2017, where gas-fired generation was about 4%, about 2.5 megatons CO2 equivalent in emissions, heading by the end of this decade where gas-fired generation will be 25% of generation in terms of output. So that is the same portion that coal was before the coal phase out. The GHG emissions from the sector will basically octuple towards 20 megatons CO2 equivalent. So the growth curve on gas emissions is basically vertical at this stage. So that's where we've been heading. This is just showing you here where we think we sort of bottomed out somewhere around 2017. A bit of a dip because of the pandemic, because demand went down, but now we're going up and away. And indeed, the actual curve is this is an older one. It's actually turning out to be even more vertical. So that's where we are in reality. At the end of last year, there was a little bit of a reopening on renewables. There was a proposal that there would be 2,000 megawatts of new supply from renewables by 2030, with the potential for another 3,000 megawatts. But at the same time, there was a double down on nuclear that the Pickering B refurbishment was confirmed. And in the background, we have to keep in mind that electricity rates are being subsidized in Ontario to the tune of $7.3 billion a year. That's coming out of general revenues. So that is money that would otherwise be going on schools and hospitals. So that's the other sort of fiscal aspect of where we're at the moment. There has been a further twist just in the last week and a bit, that the original procurement that they were talking about for potentially up to 5,000 megawatts of renewables magically was recast by our new Minister of Energy as technologically agnostic, meaning that gas and nuclear could conceivably be bid in response to that request for proposals. So even the little opening that was there around renewables is clearly being eroded, potentially in favor of gas. There's some debate about what will really be economic in this context, but clearly this is being interpreted as a pretty serious backpedal from what had been thought to be at least a little bit of an opening on the renewable side. So basically where we're at is a situation where we are embedding um, rising costs given the large nuclear investment. Um, and this is from the Clean Air Alliance, but I think these are reasonable numbers, particularly for new nuclear, based on the experiences in Europe, the US. Um, somewhere between 20 and 30 cents per kilowatt hour seems to be where new nuclear is landing, which is deeply uneconomic, given where wind and solar and storage are now starting to land. And of course, emissions are rising dramatically because of this ramp up of gas-fired generation. So it's a high cost, high emission pathway that we seem to be on. And the problem, of course, particularly with nuclear, is these are very long-lived, very large and very, very long-lived investments. So that they do run the problem um, that once you're committed, and you're kind of stuck with it for a very, very, very long time. Um, one of the interesting dimensions of this is that probably more than any other jurisdiction in Canada, there has been very extensive modeling of different potential pathways for the province to have taken. I've just given a sampling here, work that was done for the Atmospheric Fund, which looked at net zero by 2035 with 2035 without new nuclear, without the Pickering refurbishment, and without additional gas. And that emerged as quite viable. Much stronger emphasis on the efficiency and conservation side, and also strengthening the relationship with Quebec, which is becoming a slightly more complicated part of the discussion. David Suzuki Foundation did a series of modeling runs using very, very sophisticated models. I think the most sophisticated models in the country, looking at net zero scenarios for all provinces, including Ontario, that again do not have assumed a phase down of nuclear over time, and certainly no additional gas. The IESO itself did a very groundbreaking study on what are termed distributed energy resources. This is rooftop solar at a building level, tied together with facility or building level energy storage, Tesla power walls, and network together into more substantial resources, something we're talking about doing at the university right now. And their conclusion, again, interestingly, certainly no need for additional gas. That there was a great deal of potential, achievable potential in this space. This is the earlier Navigant energy efficiency potential study. There's a newer one underway at the moment as well. So there's been a lot of work done in terms of what a not nuclear and gas heavy pathway for Ontario towards net zero might look like. Um, Obviously, this has had absolutely zero effect on what the province has actually chosen to do so far. And of course, all of this in the context that there is no planning process. There certainly is no review process. Like something like Powering Ontario's future growth does not have to go in front of the Energy Board or any other body to where one would ask the questions, as has happened in the past, about, does this make sense? Is this the most economically and environmentally reasonable pathway for Ontario to pursue? What alternatives might have been considered? There is no process by which that happens now in Ontario. And this is quite different because previously we have one way or another, when we've had these kinds of large scale plans, they were subject to some kind of review. And quite frequently they fell apart when that review happened. So that's sort of where we are. There are a whole series of deepening challenges here. The reactor technologies, particularly for the new builds, are at this stage largely unknown. There is one sort of identified for Darlington, but no one's actually ever built one of these before. So the costs are unknown. There is a continuing record on new build nuclear from the previous nuclear renaissance of massive delays and cost overruns. There really only were four projects that ever came out of that for all the fuss. And all of them have been fantastic, ridiculous economic disasters. Hinkley and Flamanville are still not even in service. Siemens sold Oleg Buktu for €1 at one point to get out from under the debt. How this is going to be financed, nobody knows. I mean, ultimately, it's going to end up on the rate base, I assume. But exactly how this will be financed is completely unclear. There's waste management issues, and particularly if we move towards non-can-do reactor type technologies, that's its own set of questions, because the entire nuclear waste management organization exercise over the past 50 years, it goes all the way back to the 70s, has always been premised on the notion that the waste nuclear fuel that we would need to manage would be what comes out of a can-do reactor, which, if nothing else, is well understood and well characterized. We don't know what the nature of the waste fuels coming out of new reactor technologies would actually be. And indeed, efforts to pursue answers to those questions have been notably unsuccessful. It's not clear the designers know themselves. More broadly, I mean, this whole thing, this whole expansion is premised on an assumption that we're moving to net zero. And yet the province has absolutely no plan for decarbonization. And indeed, the formal policy, for example, around space heating remains to expand the gas grid. There's been a little bit of stuff for heat pumps introduced very recently, but basically, the government has absolutely no plan to decarbonize transportation, certainly not to do anything on space heating. There's a little pieces on steel and things like that. The loads themselves are increasingly dynamic as the grid gets smarter. That's the sort of thing that conventional base load like nuclear doesn't serve well. And of course, we're in this period of enormously rapid technological development around renewables, storage, distributed resources, and microgrids, where costs have been falling dramatically and performance has been improving, and our ability to manage these things and integrate them has been getting dramatically better. So we're effectively in the middle of a convergent technological revolution, which may outstrip the conventional technologies very significantly. The big winner so far, I would argue, Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power. In keeping in mind that OPG not only owns the hydro facilities and the nuclear facilities, it also increasingly is the dominant actor on gas-fired generation. It's bought up a whole bunch of gas plants too. So the pathway that's being chosen here serves OPG's interests very well, serves Bruce Power's interests very well as well in terms of their expansion goals. I mean, this is what happens in a policy vacuum and a governance vacuum. I mean, this is effectively sort of what happened in the 1960s, when their earlier sort of expansion plans unfolded and there was really no oversight or control. So that's kind of where we're at now. The other sort of variable here is around the role of the federal government. It has adopted regulations for a coal phase out by around 2030. This doesn't affect Ontario very much because, of course, we already phased out coal. It does affect mostly Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, because Alberta, there's a whole other story which we can't talk about today, but Alberta has engaged in a very successful coal phase out of its own. There's a chapter about that in our book, and it's a sort of quiet, hidden, it's sort of very quiet success story, and one that survived the Notley to Kenny transition, and now even the Kenny to Smith transition in Alberta. This has been carried through, mostly converting to gas, but in a significant role for renewables as well. The federal government has proposed clean electricity regulations with the goal of achieving a net zero electricity grid by 2035. Um, this was very, very controversial. There was a lot of pushback from provinces. There's lots of questions of what's clean. Should nuclear count? Should CCUS, carbon capture and storage, count? In practice, this would have allowed, it's mostly a gas phase out, really, because that's really what's targeted in the clean electricity regulations. Um, and existing facilities, pre-2025 facilities, would be allowed to continue for another 20 years. This is part of the reason Ontario was very anxious to get new gas into the system, because then it would be able to run out to the 2040s. There was a lot of pushback from provinces who had thought about phasing out coal, but had not really thought that much about the possibility of what is effectively a natural gas fire generation phase out. And there was a significant back down from the federal government last February on this. So I do not know if the clean electricity regulations will see the light of day before we have a federal election. It's a big question. And I think this would continue to be very, very contested territory. Um, there is a jurisdictional question here about how far the federal government can go using its criminal law power to regulate toxic substances, um, namely greenhouse gases in this case, and other air pollutants associated with fossil fuel fired generation, versus provincial constitutional authority over electricity via Section 92A. And this is undiscovered legal country. There is no case law on point on this. And the consensus among my legal constitutional colleagues is we don't know where the court would come down. But if the federal government tries to proceed, the chances of a challenge from Alberta, Saskatchewan, and other provinces is probably pretty high. So that one's an unknown. So bottom line, at least in my view, where we are is the province is on a high cost, high risk, high impact pathway with a very strong emphasis on nuclear and fossil gas. Everything else has been marginalized. This is a little engagement on conservation, but it's more symbolic than real. Distributed resources remain firmly stuck in what's referred to as the sandbox, sort of space that the Ontario Energy Board lets some proponents play around in a little bit, but not to do anything significant. As I say, there was an opening and then a back down on renewables, it looks like, and then the door was repeatedly slammed in Quebec's face. And it may well be, based on my conversations with colleagues in Quebec, that option may now be disappearing, which could be very problematic. But we'll see. There's an entire whole debate in Quebec about all this as well on their side. If I were articulating a sustainability pathway, I would say optimize the lowest cost, lowest risk options first and go to the higher risk, higher cost options last, which would probably mean optimize conservation demand management first, pursue distributed resource development, renewables and storage, because they have this huge advantage of being very, very, very scalable and very, very fast to build. And you also decide not to build them. Probably the committed refurbishments on Darlington and Bruce at this stage are probably unavoidable. Be more expensive to get out of those contracts than to try and stop them, even if you were inclined to do so. We should not be expanding the role of gas when we're trying to get to minus 45% GHG emissions by 2030. I mean, the implication, what's happening is the province's overall GHG emissions are now going back up, after falling quite significantly from the 2010s. And I would argue new nuclear requires very, very careful examination as an option of last resort. And that's what we've done is to say exactly the opposite. Is we've gone with the high cost, high risk, high impact options first and left everything else behind. And that's pretty much where we stand as of today. So I'll wrap there for my formal remarks. My last um, pitch is that next Friday we're doing a session with folks from Quebec about what's happening there, and particularly Bill 69. And they will be talking both in terms of internal dynamics, but also implications for countries, jurisdictions with relationships or hopes of relationships with Quebec around electricity. And then on October the 10th, we're doing a webinar with colleagues at St. Thomas University in New Brunswick on the future role of nuclear in Canada. So that should be interesting as well. So I'll leave it there. I can go out of the screen share and we can go back into it if need be to sort of respond to questions. So let's leave that. Let me get the stop share to go here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. On behalf of Call and all our guests, I want to thank Professor Winfield for his extremely informative and insightful talk. What you've said is challenging, but it's really helped us to understand our existing energy situation, how it's evolved, and the challenges we now face in decarbonizing our electrical grid. I'm sure that your presentation has also sparked a lot of questions. Well, I can see as they're rolling in. I don't have to go to my back pocket questions, which is great. First question that actually got a thumbs up, so I'm going to say it first, ask it first. Terry Moore says, what is your understanding of why the Ontario government has bought so deeply into nuclear and gas versus renewables? Is this primarily about louder private sector corporate influence?
It's a very good question. I don't have a definitive answer, and which is a hard thing for a political scientist to say. I think part of what's happened here, as I hinted at in one of the slides, is absent any meaningful planning process and certainly any meaningful external oversight. The dominant incumbents have got the ear of the government, and have been apparently very persuasive. And I would say, as I hinted, it's OPG and it's Bruce Power. And keeping in mind that OPG is not just a nuclear and hydro operator now, it actually owns most of the large gas plants as well. So I've kind of suggested the policy model we're now in really resembles 1965. And there's a book about this by a friend and colleague of mine, Neil Freeman, called The Politics of Power, who talks about the relationship between the Ontario Hydroelectric Power Commission and Ontario Hydro and the government of Ontario. And that's I think the policy model we're back in, where there's just a back door to the Premier's office from the OPG C-suite, and the OPG is telling the Premier's office, here's what we need to do, and the Premier's office seems inclined to go along with it. I think there are interesting questions around where does private actors come into this. They're not interested, so far as we can see, in nuclear expansion. The only significant investor is the Federal Infrastructure Bank so far. It's the only money that's on the table for the new build at Darlington is from the Federal Infrastructure Bank. To my knowledge, there's no private investors. And I don't know how on the demand side, I don't know where they're at in the sense of the industrial consumers. I assume they think they're going to somehow continue to be protected from rate increases. And the only way that can happen is either those costs get offloaded onto residential consumers, which has happened before, or we continue to hide those costs either by subsidizing them through general revenues or hiding the accumulating debt somewhere, which is sort of what we did with the remnants of Ontario Hydro, which ultimately then ended back on electricity rates again. So that's my best answer, is that it's that the incumbents have had an insight, have absent oversight, absent having to explain to the Energy Board why any of this makes sense, or some other body, the Porter Commission in the 1980s or the Environmental Assessment Board in the 1990s. They've taken advantage of the situation, and you are dealing with a government that, not to be too impolite, is not noted for asking hard questions. That's not their instance. This is not like when you were dealing with Dwight Duncan or George Smitherman as minister, or Howie Hampton, for that matter, going back even further, who knew to ask hard questions, and I don't think that's happening at all. So that's my best explanation of what has happened in terms of the policy process, based on who looks like the winners coming out the back end.
Just as a follow-up to your answer, we are paying for the overbuilding by Ontario Hydro through increased rates and also through our taxes, because we have to support an enormous debt. Question is, should we pay the true price of electricity?
I think the short answer is probably yes, because the consequence ultimately of not doing that affects the overall fiscal position of the province and its ability to pay for other things. I mean, quite literally at the moment, we are taking $7.3 billion every year out of general revenues, the tax dollars, that otherwise would be either, we'd have virtually no deficit in Ontario, or put another way, that's money that would be available for schools and hospitals and all kinds of other things. And we're spending it to subsidize hydro rates. That was done as a Hail Mary political necessity by Kathleen Wynne in 2017 that set that in motion. It didn't work politically, but now we've kind of embedded this. We have paid down the Ontario Hydro debt at this stage. That took a long time, but we did it. The problem now at this stage, I think, is we're already seeing the costs of the nuclear refurbishments at Darlington and Bruce coming into. I said we're going to talk about the global adjustment, but it'll come up. It's effectively going into the rate base, and so that's going up. And presumably, the costs of new build would have to go into the rate base somehow as well. This is a question that, just talking to colleagues in Quebec yesterday, and we'll be talking about this on the 27th, this is something that has sort of come to the surface in Quebec. In fact, my friend Normand Mousseau at Université de Montréal had an op-ed in the Globe the other day about this very question of, in Quebec, they want to spend 185 billion. And Normand's asking the question, how is this going to be paid for? Well, it has to translate into higher rates. The problems arose. That said, we have to be very, very conscious of the impact of higher rates in lower income households and in marginalized communities. I mean, I've done work with the Low Income Energy Network. So we do have to have targeted relief for low-income consumers, otherwise marginalized consumers. Rural consumers were very heavily hit during the pre-Fair Hydro Plan period as well. I mean, that was a major driver. So I think you will have to, rates will go up, but then you need targeted relief aimed at the most vulnerable. And you also, the bigger question, of course, that this whole thing avoids, that the Atmospheric Fund and David Suzuki and others have been raising is, well, the province's path to decarbonization is not the only possibility. And there may be other paths that are actually much cheaper and much more flexible. And that's sort of what's getting marginalized, that we're not having this conversation about, is that, okay, if we want to electrify everything or mostly electrify, what's our best strategy and what's our both most effective and least cost strategy for doing that? And we just have nowhere where that conversation happens, particularly in front of any kind of meaningful regulatory body of any sort. It just isn't happening. And so with the risk is we're going to embed these enormous costs. And that will translate into higher hydro rates. It will translate into a need to try and subsidize hydro rates more, which will then erode the fiscal capacity of the province as a whole and our ability to pay for schools, hospitals, housing, social services, the whole gamut of things the province of Ontario provides. Is the ability to do that is going to be affected by this. And we don't seem to be getting to that conversation yet.
Where do you think that conversation should be happening? Should it be happening within the government or regulatory agencies, or where?
All of the above. I think our pattern in the past has been that at the end of the day, we have seen plans articulated, but then they have ultimately gone in front of some kind of body with some decision-making authority about whether or not this makes sense or not. Historically, it was the Royal Commission on Electric Power System Planning. The Porter Commission was the first time we really did that in late 70s, early 80s. It was the Environmental Assessment Board with Ontario Hydro's Demand Supply Plan. It was supposed to be with the last integrated power system plan, which is now nearly 15 years ago. It did briefly go in front of the Energy Board. So there's some body in which the assumptions could be examined and evidence could be led and alternatives thought about. What it is, I don't, there's been discussions about what this should be. But I don't think you can do this in a vacuum. I mean, we have really good examples of what happens when you do that. I mean, partially it was the original Ontario Hydro nuclear program, which led to the effective bankruptcy of Ontario Hydro. We see the same thing in Newfoundland right now over Muskrat Falls, where the federal government just had to bail Newfoundland out to the tune of $500 million more to cover the costs of Muskrat. In that case, built despite the objections of the utility board and the environmental assessment. And the same thing with Site C in BC. BC is just big enough that it's able to absorb that without being in real trouble. But this is, I mean, not to exaggerate, but this is how you bankrupt jurisdictions. This is how you erode their fiscal capacity. You think of the scale we're talking about, $400 billion if things go according to plan. That will affect the fiscal position and capacity of the province. And I think we need some process to think about this properly. We get little bits from the Auditor General, we get little bits from the Financial Accountability Office, but we are not anywhere having a real conversation. What do we do here? What's the nature of the risks? What are the pathways available to us, and what makes the most sense?
Okay. There's so many questions. I'm sure I won't get to them all. I apologize to people who I missed, but Ruth Kudluck asks a question that I've heard, and I have it as well, which is some NGOs, including, I know 350.org, are trying to have heat pumps subsidized or paid for entirely by the government. Given that greater demand for electricity will likely force us to use more gas for power generation, do you think it still makes sense to promote heat pumps for home heating?
Yeah, this is a complication arising out of Ontario's own situation, and it's one we're dealing with in the university now as well. Um, the answer, the answer is it depends. It depends on many things. I mean, a heat pump for cooling is going to be inherently more efficient than a conventional air conditioner. So for summer, it should actually reduce consumption. The tricky part is space heating in the winter. And yeah, it's a legitimate, does it make sense to replace a gas-fired furnace with a heat pump, which will push your electricity consumption up, as we've been learning in our house, um, when the marginal fuel in Ontario at the moment is gas. Um, and I think there's I'm gonna get in all kinds of trouble with friends for this one, but I think there's an underlying question there at this stage about the larger question: what do we do in terms of space heating? Um, the obvious thing being, well, first of all, we optimize building energy efficiency first, so that whatever heating or cooling load we're trying to deal with is reduced. But it's becoming a serious question in this context, that if the marginal fuel in Ontario is gas, if you're adding load, it's likely to be served by gas. Um, yeah, it's an ugly one, but it's a part of the fallout of these choices that are being made. I mean, we're struggling with this at the university now, and at least our analysis preliminarily is that we're actually better off in carbon terms and cost terms to continue to run our cogen plant than to turn it off and
Cogen
switch.
being,
Cogeneration plant. We have a combined heat and power plant. So
ah,
we're burning natural gas for hot water, but we are also generating electricity. And some of the analysis suggests that we're lower carbon doing that than switching to grid electricity completely. So it's the same sort of question in a slightly different context. So it is a very, very ugly question we're faced with, that normally we think, yes, to decarbonize, we want to electrify space heating. But if the electricity that we're using for that purpose is fossil provided, that equation starts to get a lot more complicated in terms of what do we do. And I haven't done a full analysis to answer that. I say we've been doing modeling at the level, we have a whole engineering department to model stuff at the university to think about this stuff, but we've begun to sort of wrestle with this question of if the grid is becoming that much gassier, what do we do in terms of this is a wicked question in terms
yeah,
of
no, I hope
what
you
do we
make
do?
that public because, yeah, I'm
Yeah,
involved with the home retrofit movement. And, if we're doing things that are counterproductive, then I'd really like to know about it. But okay.
yeah, it requires, I mean, hybrid systems may be part of the answer as the transition, especially for heating, where you have both a heat pump and still have a gas furnace, particularly peak heating requirements. And that seems to be a potential compromise that gets you, the heat pump should outperform a conventional air conditioner in the summer. And it is also working in the winter, but you may also burn a little bit of gas when things get very, very cold.
Fantastic. Okay. We have a couple of questions about uh, the new experimental nuclear reactors.
Yeah.
Um, Janice Wilton says she's concerned about putting experimental reactors at Darlington on Lake Ontario, the source of drinking water for 9 million people. And Terry Moore says, oh no, sorry, Peter Nicholas says that SMRs need to be near their load. I'm assuming he means near where where the electricity is being used.
Yeah.
And he estimates they'll take up to 12 city blocks. And do we want them to take over our city parks, golf courses, etc.? So what do you have to say about SMRs?
I defer to my colleague MV Ramana, who's a physicist at UBC, who's written an excellent book on this question. But the problems with SMRs just cascade in my mind. I mean, a crucial consideration around them is this existential challenge that they don't exist. No one's actually built any of the designs that are being talked about. So we would be in a very, very experimental space. These are not can-dos. They're nothing like anything we've seen in Canada before. There are questions about what does the regulator do with them? Because again, this would be outside of the CNSC's established expertise, which is around Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which they know can-dos. The cost estimates, I mean, have been going up even before they're built. I mean, NuScale, which was the sort of flagship SMR, it's not the one they're proposing for Darlington. They gave up when they're somewhere between 22 and 26 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's not clear the cost is going to work. There's lots of stuff from the Union of Concerned Scientists and others. My colleague Ramana has raised technical questions about the designs and whether or not they'll actually work. There are, as I mentioned in my presentation, unanswered questions about the nature of the wastes which may come out of these reactors. If nothing else, and there's a big thing in the Globe and Mail today about nuclear waste, if nothing else, what comes out of a can-do at Pickering or Bruce or Darlington or Point Lepreau, if nothing else, it's well characterized. We know what it is, and we have reasonable ideas about how it's likely to behave over the next million years. We don't know. And we tried asking questions, and others have asked questions about the nature of the waste streams that would come out of the various SMR designs. And nobody seems, at least nobody in the public realm, seems to have decent answers. There are concerns with some of the designs. There's one in New Brunswick that's being talked about, which would attempt to reprocess fuels from can-dos. And there has been very serious questions raised there about would that putting Canada in violation of the Nuclear Weapons Non-Proliferation Treaty? Because part of what would come out of the reprocessing process is weapons-grade isotopes. And we actually had a meeting with Foreign Affairs, which there was no answer to that question. I don't think they'd even thought of it. So yeah, and then the question of location, do you really want these things in the middle of cities? The general answer probably be no from a safety perspective, particularly with unproven technologies. I mean, there's lots of questions about whether Pickering would ever have been permitted today, given its proximity to a densely populated urban area. It sits on a minor fault line. There's all kinds of questions there. So yeah, it's just, but technically not there, economics dodgy, a whole bunch of other questions that come up, to which there don't seem to be answers. I mean, Saskatchewan, very interestingly, was sort of going to engage on this. And we were just talking with colleagues in Sask, who are now saying what the Saskatchewan government's going to do is wait and see what happens in Ontario. And then they might decide to proceed with one of these SMRs or not. It's a very interesting move. So they want us to be the guinea pig, keeping in mind too that what's being proposed in Darlington isn't small or modular. It's really just a new build reactor, a new build boiling water reactor, which is quite different from what we've seen before. And it's a non-Canadian design. It's Hitachi and GE. So just just the questions around SMRs, at least for me, just cascade and cascade and cascade, around which we just don't seem to get answers. And I think the fact that the only private capital, well, sorry, so far as we can tell, there is zero private capital engaged with the Darlington project. Say the only investor is the Federal Infrastructure Bank, which is basically the government of Canada. So
Okay,
that should be telling you something. If private capital won't touch something with a 1-billion-foot pole, that's usually a signal that there's a problem.
yeah. Okay, so that nicely leads me to the last question, which a number of people have raised, which is that many of people in this of the people in this audience are involved in climate advocacy efforts. What one or two things would you should we focus on in our advocacy work? What do you think would have the greatest impact, and who should we be addressing? What agencies should we be targeting to change the direction? Is it the Office of the Provincial Auditor? Is that a possible place?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I was one of the founders of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. I have to say that up front. So, I was one of the 4 people who sat at the table when we founded the alliance in 1996. I would look at their work. I think the places to pressure, and at this stage, it's largely a question, to quote Dr. Seuss, of noise, noise, noise. That, and at the end of the day, the real decision-making power is clearly in the Premier's office and to a certain degree in Minister Lecce's office. So they're the ones who need to be hearing noise, that people are not happy about where this is going. Because there's nowhere else. I mean, you can't go to the Energy Board. You can't go, the environmental assessment process, it doesn't really exist anymore in a meaningful way. I would lean a bit on Miss Crombie and on Ms. Stiles as well.
Mhm.
Because they've not been as vocal about this as they could be. And have not been asking hard questions about how much is this going to cost, how are we going to pay for it, do we have alternatives? So those would be, if I was targeting someone at this stage, that's probably who I would be going directly to, because clearly the decisions are coming exclusively out of the Premier's office. And so the extent to which Mr. Ford's admittedly usually remarkably good political antenna are picking something up, that would probably be a good place to start to ask questions.
And to make some noise.
And to make noise. If they're hearing, if your local MP is hearing stuff, if they're a conservative, but even if they're a liberal or a New Democrat, or even a Green, because you have to encourage the Greens to keep asking. The only person who asks questions about this these days seems to be Mike Schreiner. And we also need to encourage him to keep doing that, to keep asking questions. But the silence on all this from the Liberals and the NDP has also been quite deafening. And they could be encouraged to do more. I mean, Mr. Tabbins with the NDP is very good, but he's one voice. So they need a little encouragement too. But that's my best answer. Is just there has to be noise in the system. There has to be a message. There's a problem here, and that people are starting to pay attention and ask questions.
It's a very good answer, and Dr. Seuss always gives very good advice, so we should listen. So Dr. Winfield, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your knowledge, for giving us a better understanding, not only of the challenges we face, but of what we can do, what we might do to set the province on a more sustainable path. So appreciated.
I think this was a lovely meeting. Karen, Sadler Brown, Janet, and Liz, my immense thanks, and I believe the audiences as well. Thank you, everyone.
Good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.